And racism were important aspects of World War One for two reasons. First, idea about the race had developed over the course of the 19th century to make the concept of the more predominant preoccupations of modern Europeans, and secondly, to serve as the major belligerents of war between 1914 and 1918, as many of them produced and had large colonial empires, where white Europeans ruled over the Africans, Asians, and to a certain extent the Pacific Islanders and Afro-Caribbean countries. These two factors came together to be a large part of the justification for the possession of colonial territories that were the supposed right of the superior white to rule over the allegedly inferior non-whites. This in turn led several European combatant nations to make up their own colonial resources, both material and men, to wage war. Thus, while purely military and political considerations often shaped strategies during war, ideologies of race and racism played a role, helping in particular make a war a generally global war and making it World War One. By the early 20th century, thinking about race was moving towards a more biological understanding of human differences and its significance. So, for example, a black person who has adapted to live to the Saharas cannot immediately go to, let's say, Norway or Finland and expect to be warm all year round, and the vice versa goes for a Swedish or a Finnish person moving to the Saharas and expecting to survive the warm climates. It does not work like that. But this was all brought to a halt, especially at World War One. A lot of advancements and stuff were going on at World War One, and World War One kind of put a halt to that, but in the end kind of advanced warfare as we know it. But even though we were trying to strive towards that biological concept earlier, we still have these racial indifferences and differences that would not disappear completely. For instance, many believe that the war pitted the English and French races against the Germanic and the Teutonic races. Another area was kind of a national and ethnic understanding of races that played a role in the Balkans as well, where the war began because of the Slavs and the ethnic minorities within Austro-Hungary itself. Despite ethnic tensions and nationalist aspirations helped to ignite the war of 1914 when Serbian nationalists assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And the same factors were paramount in the American President Woodrow Wilson's call for a national self-determination during the war and the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Alright, the colonial side of racism. European colonial possessions, particularly in Africa and Asia, and to some extent the Oceanic regions and the Caribbean region, played the most important role in the interjecting race and racism into World War I strategy. The race factor was more visible in the million of colonial subjects as workers and soldiers. Many Africans and Asians were laborers, and they were fought on their home territory as well, mostly in Africa, but the Asian workers would actually go to Europe. But they had done this before the war actually, with the conquest of their homeland with the Senegal Tyrols, and the Senegal Tyrols would actually conquer most of North Africa for the French. But hundreds of thousands travelled to new lands to contribute to the war effort, such as Gallipoli, Palestine, Eritrea, all over German East Africa and Southwest Africa, and of course the Oceanic provinces with the Japanese and other such things, and even on the Western Front and to Europe itself. France was a colonial power with the most enthusiastic outlook at deploying the colonial population, especially in Europe. Some 200,000 French would be working in the industrial centres and even being on the front lines, being as loggers, diggers, trench diggers and other stuff like that. But even more, 500,000 men were to wear the uniform of the French army and man the trenches on the Western Front. Even before the war, military officers like Charles Manjing, the Butcher of Verdun, even though he was still an important part in taking Fort Davos, advocated for recruiting the vast reserves of men in Africa and Indochina to strengthen the French army in the face of the larger and more populous Germany. When the war began in 1914, soldiers from North West Africa, Indochina, and the French Caribbean, and even from Quebec, had joined the French ranks to play an active role in the fighting. Eventually, soldiers from Indochina, Madagascar, and other such places that were still off the map but still French colonies saw service in France. These men were often very popular among the French people, although many in the French regarded non-Europeans through a haze of racial stereotypes. For instance, black West Africans were popular and celebrated for their courage and loyalty, but also degraded for the primal savagery and the mental inferiority and the cannibalism that did happen, but Not really during 1914, kinda, maybe. Alright, that was the French. Now, the biggest, Britain. Now for the biggest empire, Britain. The British Army had deployed the Colonial soldiers, a force of nearly 140,000 Indians, to serve on the Western Front in 1914. But they were departed from the front and from Europe altogether in 1915 when British authorities were concerned of the efforts and the effects of putting non-whites against white Europeans in battle. Indians with such experience might be more difficult to rule after the war. Some in the end, the bulk of the Indian soldiers would fight in World War I, some 1 million of them in all actually, fought in the Middle East against the Germans in the Allied Ottoman Empire, and they were also sent with the West Indian troops, the Afro-Caribbean, the Barbadian, Trinidadian, Jamaican, Bermudas, that sort of place, to fight alongside their brothers in Africa as well. Racial politics precluded arming the black South Africans from combat in Europe, though 20 of them actually saw service in France, mostly as labourers, and in the case the French news troops from its colonies, the participation of men in the British war effort were visible in the public, reinforcing a racial stereotype in some cases and some enchanting the awareness of the conflict of World War I. The combat nations with extensive colonial possessions like Belgium, Portugal and Italy did not make their colonies go to Europe. Well, they couldn't because it was too cold, the mountains of Monte Grappa and the Tyrol's were too high and too cold, but they did lend them to Britain and France in the German East Africa and German Southwest Africa campaigns, and they did actually mostly use them as porters and ambulance drivers and stuff like that. The Germans did the same with their African subjects for the African campaign only and did not really make a lot of them go to Europe as well, but they called it an uncivilized warfare and racial inferior wars to the conflict home in Europe when the British and the French were bringing colonial possessions like the black and Indo-Chinese people to Europe to fight the Germans, when the Germans did not do that for their colonial troops, mostly having them as drummers, and maybe one saw combat, but there were only like 12 or 20 black African Germans on the front, on the Western Front in all togetherness. Weird. The Ottoman Empire, Muslim and Islam. The most obvious case of colonial consideration was helping shape the strategy of war, with the Germans attempting to explain the most obvious case of colonial consideration helping to shape the strategy of war was that of Germany using to exploit the Muslim religious faith of some of its enemies, such as the Chechens, the Kyrgyzstanis, and the Turkmenistans of the Russian Empire, the Pakistanis, and some Central African republics, and of course all of French North Africa. Don't even question it. The German army made much of the exotic soldiers it captured from among the enemy troops, often subjecting Africans and Asians to anthropological studies in the camps, using images of the prisoners as propaganda. The Germans also gathered together one special camp near Berlin for all Muslim prisoners captured from the Russian, France and British armies. This was the Half Moon Camp, named after the Muslim symbol of the crescent moon, was the site of an aggressive propaganda campaign to convince these men to switch to the side to fight against their colonial masters. After all, Germany was allied with the Muslim Ottoman Empire, and the Sultanate of Constantinople declared a jihad, calling the faithful to fight for the Ottoman Empire. These efforts mostly failed, as did other German attempts to encourage the Muslim populations of the Russian Caucasus, the British Indians, and of course the French North Africans, and even Afghanistan for a time, but they had too much bear on them. That's another story for another day, to rise up against their colonial masters in the name of Islam. But this effort was a serious one and demonstrated the importance of the role of non-European peoples and the land that played a geopolitical and strategic game during the conflict, and would even be revived for World War II. So the conclusion is, race and racism helped shape both the approaches of combat nations waging war in World War I, and the experiences of the war for millions of people among the European public and the European colonial possessions in Africa and Asia. From the color of their skin to the contents of their religious beliefs, the colonized people attributes were a major concern for those making decisions about whether and how to wage war again. In fact, the very radical and cultural differences of non-European people gave the European colonial powers a sense of entitlement to rule these colonial possessions in the first place. Then, during the war, these differences were justified again to make use of the African and Asians as workers, soldiers, and objects of European strategy. Not too harsh compared to America. Boy, when we do the American episode, prepare for the N-word to be dropped a lot. Anyway, I hope you learned something, and I'm actually surprised that they didn't say the N-word. I'm just kidding. They will, but I won't. Not today. Not today. Because I'm kind of tired. And I may be taken out of context, because when I'm tired, not thinking straight. Anyway, hope you learned something. And of course, let's see. What do we have to talk about? So, race and racism. What did it lead to? World War II. What? But World War II was just a continuation of World War I because of the Versailles Treaty. Yes? No. Of course, we know of the Jewish population in Germany and all over Europe. The famous stabbed in the back myth was actually derived from the 1919 peace treaty, and that is why Hitler went on a genocidal rampage for the Jews of Europe. Secondly, Japan. Why still minor in this conflict? Japan had actually sent out 21 demands to China during these periods, captured German Samoa, and I think Micronesia, Samoa, and they captured Papua New Guinea, Samoa, some German scattered islands like German Micronesia, stuff like that. And of course they captured the Tsingtao region of China, which is the bottom of China, near the Yalu River, near the border near Korea. Anyway, all these colonial possessions into the newly formed Japanese Empire, which only had Korea and Taiwan by this time, was actually beginning to grow, and the Japanese, just like the Europeans, had saw these other indigenous Asian people as inferior. And with this, the Japanese, especially towards the Europeans saw the Japanese as inferior, and in turn, just like a kid being bullied at school, the Japanese said he was the best Asian of all the Asians, and that is what led to World War II. And of course, World War I also brought about a lot of African Americans going overseas, being segregated from the whites, and of course that was the start of the civil rights movement way before World War II and Vietnam. So, what did World War I do for race? It's still subjugated, and it's still reinforced, but the beginning of the end was actually starting to come about in this racial system. Yes, I quote, hyphenated race system. Yes, a race system. Because, you want to know why South Africa had apartheid? Well, it's kind of a loose story and it's kind of meh, but this is the story. James Cecil Rhodes, the person that actually made South and North Rhodesia, was actually very kind to black people, especially when he went to South Africa for the first time. He was born in England and he moved to South Africa. And of course, James Rhodes became this infamous businessman, the devil, the white devil of Africa, he's now known. You want to know why? James Rhodes actually made an apartheid system within South Africa, because if the blacks and whites were united on this issue, he will not get the diamonds of South Africa, and he won't get the Cape to Cairo railway that he promised the Queen of England. So what he did was to divide and conquer the blacks and whites of the newly formed South African Republic, and that is how the whole apartheid system had gotten into place. But yet, that is a story for another day, and race and racism has always been this divide and conquer strategy, because when you look at it, we all bleed we all bleed red, sorry. Yeah, that's a famous quote from the Ron Burgundy movie. That one guy, the idiot, had actually said the most truth. We all bleed red, and death is the only equalizer. No matter how big your nose is, no matter how bird-like your nose is, no matter how kinky your hair is, no matter how straight your hair is, no matter how dark your skin is, no matter how white your skin is, death and blood are the only equalizers in this world. And of course, we're the human race, we're the mankind, we're the humankind. We're not the black kind, we're not the white kind, we're not the Asian kind, we're not the Teutonic kind, but not the Prussian kind. Well, there's the Prussian kind. I'm just kidding. We're all the humankind, or as John Trudeau would say, we are the people kind. So, you know, it should be more inclusive because human, really, cis white male, human. I don't want to be called mankind or humankind. I want to be called people kind. So, yeah, making fun of of race. What? Yeah, race doesn't exist. Yeah, we'll tackle that later in the video before I get called the ultra-right supreme nationalist black person, well, mixed race person. Anyway, I'm gonna stop it before I get called a Hitler, mixed race Hitler. Anyway, hope you learned something, and I hope this kind of opened your eyes to race and racism and the system, because as you see, it is a system. It is not a biological difference, because the Europeans know it's not a biological difference. It is a system. That was actually the whole message, but if you're too PC to understand, that was the message. It is a system to make Africans and Asians do what you want, and to make yourself feel good about enslaving the Africans and the Asians.